Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be exploring a concept that might just turn your ideas about teamwork upside down.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah, it's self-selection.
Okay.
We've got a fascinating book with us today that is packed with case studies and insights from experts,
All right.
all about letting employees choose their own teams.
I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a timely topic. We're seeing more and more companies trying to become agile.
Right.
But, the traditional ways of building teams just aren't cutting it anymore.
Yeah. And the book actually opens with a great example from a company called TradeMe,
Yeah.
which is a major e-commerce player in New Zealand.
Wow.
They decided to try a large-scale self-selection event.
All right.
And the results were pretty remarkable.
Interesting.
Yeah. But before we kind of get into that,
Okay.
let's just step back for a second
Sure.
and look at the traditional approaches to team formation.
Okay.
So you've got the classic managerial selection,
Right.
where managers pick the teams based on skills. Makes sense in theory, but it can become a real bottleneck as companies grow.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it often leads to teams that look good on paper,
Right.
but lack that crucial element of chemistry,
Yeah.
that spark that comes from people genuinely wanting to work together.
Yeah. The book, actually, the authors make a great point
Okay.
about why that falls short.
Okay.
And that is team design is actually a critical factor for success.
I could see that.
And it's more than just matching skills.
Yeah.
So J. Richard Hackman,
Oh.
who's like a leading expert on teams,
Right.
found that teams with good design are actually 60% more effective.
Wow. That's a huge number.
Yeah.
That's huge.
So it's not just about, plopping people together.
Yeah, no, it's interesting what you said about the design, because self-selection puts the power of the design into the hands of the employees.
Yeah. So instead of managers playing matchmaker,
Uh-huh.
you let the employees choose who they want to work with,
Right.
which on the surface might sound a bit like,
A recipe for disaster.
yeah, letting a bunch of kids loose in a candy store.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely a fear factor there.
Yeah.
But the book dives deep into how to structure this process
Okay.
to avoid chaos
Mm-hmm.
and actually get amazing results.
Okay.
They called it a recipe for successful self-selection.
I like that.
Yeah. A recipe.
Yeah. The first ingredient is a readiness check.
Okay.
Okay.
So essentially you need to ask yourself,
Yeah.
does our company culture even support this?
Right.
Like, are we
Yeah.
truly ready to give employees this level of autonomy?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And are the managers on board?
Right.
Because if they're going to be micromanaging the teams after they're formed,
Yeah.
it defeats the whole purpose.
Totally. And the book also stresses the importance of transparency.
Okay.
So you've got to communicate the plan, the risks, the potential rewards
Right.
to everyone involved.
Yeah.
Now, what's fascinating is that this whole idea of self-selection isn't actually new.
Oh, okay.
The book mentions that the RAF, the Royal Air Force.
The British Royal Air Force, yeah.
Wow.
They use this approach with their bomber crews
Okay.
back in World War II.
Really?
Yeah.
They let the pilots choose their own crew members.
Yeah, in the middle of a war.
That seems incredibly risky.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But I guess think about the stakes involved.
Yeah.
I mean, they needed crews that were not only skilled,
Right.
but also highly cohesive and able to perform under intense pressure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So-
true. It worked.
Well, the book doesn't go into great detail about it,
Right.
but it does highlight that it was successful.
Wow. I mean, it makes you wonder what other traditional management practices we could be rethinking.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, okay, back to the recipe.
Okay.
After the readiness check, the next step is defining the teams.
Okay.
So what kind of squads do we need?
Right.
What are their missions?
Yeah.
Are there any roles that need to be pre-selected? Like product owners?
Right. And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
The book argues that you should keep the rules and constraints to an absolute minimum.
Really?
The fewer rules, the better.
Why is that? Wouldn't some guidelines help to ensure that the teams are balanced and capable?
Well, their point is that the whole point of self-selection is to empower people to solve the puzzle themselves.
Oh, okay.
If you have too many rules,
Right.
you're basically back to managerial selection.
Just in disguise.
Just in disguise, exactly.
Right, yeah. You're not truly trusting the process.
Exactly.
So in the TradeMe example,
Okay.
what were the ground rules they set for the self-selection event?
Okay. So they kept it super simple.
Okay.
First, squads had to be capable of delivering end-to-end,
I mean,
meaning they couldn't be dependent on other teams to get things done.
got it.
So this ensured each team had a diverse set of skills to cover all aspects of a project, from design and development to marketing and testing.
Okay, so that makes sense if you're aiming for autonomous agile teams.
Exactly. Second, they stipulated that squads had to be small, between 3 and 7 people.
Okay.
This is a common principle in agile methodologies.
Right.
Smaller teams tend to be more cohesive, communicate more effectively, and everyone has to be more cross-functional.
Right. You can't have a specialist for every single task when you're working in a small, self-contained unit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it probably helps prevent those too many cooks in the kitchen situations.
Exactly.
So, third rule,
Okay, what's number 3?
all teams had to be co-located.
Meaning no remote teams, all in the same office.
No remote teams, no one spread across time zones.
Interesting. And I'm guessing that's because face-to-face interaction is just crucial, especially in those early stages of team formation.
Absolutely. It's all about building trust and fostering those informal interactions that are so important for collaboration.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is what they didn't specify
Which was
seniority levels.
So they didn't say, like, how many senior or junior people should be on each team.
Exactly. They didn't try to predetermine that balance, which is a common practice in managerial selection.
So they were really putting a lot of faith in the employees to kind of figure that out on their own.
Absolutely.
What was the thinking behind that?
Well, the authors argue that it reinforces the idea of autonomy.
Oh, okay.
It also acknowledges that people aren't just interchangeable cogs in a machine.
Right.
Right. A senior developer with great communication skills might be a better fit for a certain team than a technically brilliant but less collaborative one.
So it's about looking beyond just the technical skills and considering that human element as well.
Right. And it recognizes that each team might have different needs and dynamics.
Yeah.
What works for one team might not work for another.
Okay, so we've got our readiness check. We've defined our teams. We've established some basic ground rules.
Yep.
What's the next ingredient in this self-selection recipe?
Okay, well, now comes the fun part.
Okay.
Planning the actual event.
All right.
And the book emphasizes that this is not just a meeting. It's an interactive, engaging experience.
Okay.
You want people to feel energized and excited about building their dream teams.
All right.
Think of it more like a team-building workshop or even a game.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What does that look like in practice?
Okay, so, for example, at Trade Me,
Okay.
they had a big countdown clock projected on the wall
Uh-huh.
to create a sense of urgency.
I like it.
And they used a whistle to signal the end of each round.
A whistle. Like a gym teacher.
Exactly.
I love it.
They wanted to create a fun, high-energy atmosphere.
Okay.
And visually, they had these large squad diagrams posted around the room
Okay.
with photos of all the participants.
Oh.
So you could literally see the teams taking shape as people moved their photos from one diagram to another.
That's such a good idea.
Yeah, much more engaging than just sitting around a table.
Yeah, I love that visual element.
But they also had skill stickers and checklists so teams could visually assess if they had all the necessary skills covered.
Oh, that's cool.
So if a team realized they were missing, say, a UX designer, they could actively seek one out.
I see. So they're not just looking at faces. They're looking at, like, we need this, we need this, we need this.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's smart.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got the visual setup.
Yes.
What about the actual process of self-selection? How does that work?
Okay, so the book recommends having a clear agenda with timed rounds of self-selection, interspersed with checkpoints for feedback and adjustments.
So you're saying it's not just like everybody just runs to a board and throws their picture up. There's some structure to it.
There's some structure to it.
I like that.
Yeah, think of it as a series of sprints where people make choices, see how those choices impact the overall picture, and then iterate based on that feedback.
So it's not a one-and-done deal.
Exactly.
People have a chance to reconsider their choices and make adjustments
Exactly.
as they go along.
Yeah, and the book says it typically takes 3 rounds for the magic to happen.
3 rounds. Okay, so what happens in each round?
Okay, so round 1 is usually a bit of a free-for-all.
Okay.
People are hesitant, they're testing the waters.
Great.
You might end up with some weirdly unbalanced teams, like a squad with 7 developers and no designers.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's like the first draft of anything.
Yeah.
It's rarely perfect.
Right.
But in round 2, things start to get interesting.
Okay.
People have had a chance to chat, to observe what others are doing,
Right.
and they start making more strategic choices.
Okay.
The teams start to become more balanced, more cohesive.
So the chaos around 1 starts to give way to a bit more order and intention.
Exactly.
Okay, what about round 3?
Round 3 is where the real magic happens.
Ooh, okay.
People are now comfortable with the process. They're talking to each other, negotiating, even lobbying to get the people they want on their team.
It's like a marketplace for talent.
It is.
Everyone's pitching their skills and trying to find the best fit.
Precisely. And what's amazing is that this all happens organically.
Okay.
The facilitators don't tell people what to do. They
Right.
just create the space and the structure for self-organization to emerge.
So it's not about controlling the outcome.
Right.
It's about creating the conditions for the right outcome to emerge.
Exactly.
That's a pretty powerful concept.
It is. It really challenges the traditional top-down approach to management.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
But what if they get stuck?
Okay.
What if, even after 3 rounds, some teams just can't seem to form?
That's a great question. The book offers some tips for dealing with those tricky situations.
Okay.
Sometimes simply calling it a day and letting people sleep on it can help.
Yeah, fresh
A
perspective.
fresh perspective is all it takes sometimes.
Yeah.
You could focus in on the problem areas by sending people who are already in complete teams home.
Okay.
This allows for more targeted discussion and problem solving among those who are still figuring things out.
So you're basically creating a smaller, more focused working group
Exactly.
to tackle the remaining challenges.
Exactly.
Right.
Another option is to introduce what they call hire cards.
Okay.
These are basically placeholders for roles that need to be filled through recruitment.
I see.
So this allows teams to move forward even if they don't have all the people they need right now.
Right. It's like saying, okay, we know we need a UX designer,
Yeah.
but we haven't found the right person yet. We'll keep looking, but in the meantime, let's move forward with the rest of the team.
Exactly.
That's smart.
Yeah, it's a smart way to avoid getting bogged down in the recruitment process.
So let's say we've gone through this whole self-selection event.
Uh-huh.
The teams are formed, everyone's happy.
Yep.
What happens next? How do you make those teams a reality?
That's where we'll pick up in part 2.
Ooh, a cliffhanger.
Yes.
All right, we'll see you in part 2.
Welcome back to the deep dive.
So we left off with the teams formed, everyone buzzing from the self-selection event,
Yeah.
ready to hit the ground running.
Ready to go.
But how do you actually make that happen?
Right.
It's not like you just say, go team,
Uh,
and expect magic, right?
right. There's a crucial step here that the book really emphasizes,
Right.
protecting the outcome of the self-selection event.
What does that mean exactly?
It means that managers need to resist the urge to tinker with the teams after they've been formed.
Okay.
They can't start moving people around based on their own perceptions or preconceived notions.
Because that would totally undermine the trust that was built during the self-selection process.
Exactly, yeah. Imagine pouring your heart into choosing your ideal team,
Right,
only to have a manager come in and say, nope, we need you over here.
right.
It would feel like a betrayal.
Totally. So how do you avoid that? How do you make sure that the managers are truly on board with the outcome?
The book recommends meeting with each new team as soon as possible, ideally the next day,
Okay.
to discuss logistics, expectations,
Uh-huh.
and any concerns they might have.
So it's like a debrief, but also a chance to reiterate that this is for real,
Right.
that their choices are being respected.
Precisely. And it's also an opportunity for the managers to provide support and guidance without dictating the team's direction.
Right.
This is where strong leadership skills really come into play.
Yeah, it sounds like a delicate balancing act.
It is.
You want to be supportive without being controlling.
Exactly. And that leads us to the next important step, kicking off the new squads.
Okay.
The book stresses the importance of autonomy in this phase as well.
Meaning giving the teams the freedom to choose their own way of working.
Exactly. Instead of forcing every team into a one-size-fits-all approach,
Right.
the authors suggest that teams should have the autonomy to choose their own agile practices, their own tools and processes.
So they might decide to do Scrum, Kanban, or some hybrid of the two.
Yeah.
Or maybe they come up with something entirely new.
Exactly. It's all about finding what works best for them, given their specific goals, dynamics, and personalities.
I love that.
Yeah.
It acknowledges that every team is unique and there's no one right way to do things.
Right. It's about empowering teams to take ownership of their own success.
But autonomy doesn't mean abandoning the teams to fend for themselves, right?
Of course not. The book also talks about the importance of ongoing support.
Okay.
Even with the best design and the most enthusiastic members, teams can still face challenges.
Right.
Right.
So it's like giving them a map and a compass, but also having a guide available to help them navigate the terrain.
Precisely. And that's where agile coaches or mentors can play a valuable role.
Okay.
They can help teams troubleshoot problems, refine their processes, and continuously improve their ways of working.
So they're like a safety net, but also a source of inspiration and guidance?
Exactly. And ultimately, the goal is to create a culture where teams are not only self-selected, but also self-managing and self-improving.
I'm starting to see why this idea is catching on.
Yeah.
It's not just about productivity.
Right.
It's about creating a more fulfilling and human-centered workplace.
Absolutely. It's about tapping into people's intrinsic motivation, their desire to do meaningful work with people they respect and admire.
It's about creating an environment where people feel valued, trusted, and empowered to do their best work.
Exactly. And speaking of doing their best work, let's revisit the Trade Me example.
Okay.
Remember how they went through this whole self-selection process?
Yeah.
Well, the book actually dives into the long-term effects of that experiment,
Okay.
and the results are fascinating.
Okay. I'm all ears.
Okay.
What happened? Did self-selection actually make a difference in the long run?
Well, first of all, happiness went up significantly.
How did they measure that? Did they just ask people, hey, are you happier now?
They used a tool called the HIP survey, which stands for Happiness, Innovation, and Productivity.
Okay.
It assesses employee sentiment and perceptions across these three areas.
Okay.
And what they found was that after implementing self-selection, scores for happiness increased significantly across the board.
So it wasn't just a fleeting feeling of, yay, I got to pick my team.
Right.
This was sustained happiness.
Exactly. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
If you're working with people you chose to be with on projects you're passionate about,
Right.
and in a way that suits your style,
Yeah.
it's bound to boost your overall job satisfaction.
Totally. And I imagine that increased happiness would lead to all sorts of other positive outcomes.
You're right. The book also mentions that stress levels went down at Trade Me after they switched to self-selection.
So it wasn't just about being happier, it was also about feeling less stressed.
Yes.
I'm curious, did they uncover any reasons why stress levels decreased?
The book found that a major contributing factor was team stability.
Okay.
Self-selected teams experienced 40% fewer interpersonal conflicts, likely due to that increased buy-in and shared purpose we talked about earlier.
So less time spent dealing with interpersonal issues, more time to focus on the work itself.
Precisely. And that brings us to the holy grail of any organizational change, productivity.
Right.
Did self-selection actually move the needle on that front?
I'm guessing the answer is yes, given that we're talking about it.
You're right. The answer is a resounding yes.
Okay.
Trade Me saw a marked increase in their overall output after implementing self-selection.
Okay, but how do you measure productivity in software development? It's not like you're counting widgets on an assembly line.
True, it's not that simple, but there are ways to measure output and efficiency.
Okay.
The book mentions that Trade Me looked at metrics like throughput, meaning how many user stories were shipped in a given time frame,
Okay.
and cycle time, which measures how long it takes to get a project from idea to launch.
Okay.
Both of these metrics showed significant improvement after the switch to self-selection.
So they were moving faster and getting more done.
And not only that, the quality of their work improved as well.
Wow.
They saw fewer bugs, less rework, and an overall increase in customer satisfaction.
So self-selection led to happier, less stressed employees who were also more productive and delivered higher quality work.
Yeah.
Sounds like a win-win situation across the board.
It does, doesn't it? But the benefits go even deeper than that. The book also highlights the intangible benefits, like increased innovation and a stronger sense of ownership among employees.
Because when people feel trusted and empowered, they're more likely to bring their best selves to work, right?
Absolutely.
They're not afraid to take risks, to experiment, to challenge the status quo.
Exactly. And they're also more likely to feel a sense of ownership over their work, which leads to higher levels of engagement and commitment.
So it's not just about forming teams, it's about fostering a culture of innovation, ownership, and continuous improvement.
Precisely, and that's what makes self-selection so powerful.
Yeah.
It's a catalyst for positive change on so many levels.
Okay, so this all sounds amazing, but I'm sure some listeners are thinking, this sounds great for a tech company in New Zealand, but would it work in my industry, in my company?
Right.
What would you say to those folks?
That's a valid question, and honestly, there's no guarantee that self-selection will work for everyone. It depends on a lot of factors, including company culture, leadership style, and the nature of the work itself.
So it's not a magic bullet, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly, but the authors of the book do offer a challenge to anyone who's intrigued by this concept.
Okay.
Think about your own work environment.
Yeah.
Could self-selection work for you?
Mm-hmm.
What are the potential benefits and challenges?
Yeah.
And if you're willing to experiment, they provide a roadmap for getting started.
It's like they're saying, don't just take our word for it.
Yeah.
Try it out for yourself and see what happens.
Exactly. And the beauty of it is that you can start small.
Right.
You don't have to overhaul your entire organizational structure overnight.
Right.
You could pilot this approach with one team or department, gather data,
Uh-huh.
and then see if it makes sense to scale it up.
So it's about being thoughtful, intentional, and data-driven in your approach.
Absolutely.
And speaking of data, we've talked a lot about the positive outcomes of self-selection.
Uh-huh.
But are there any potential downsides or risks to consider?
That's a great question, and one we'll tackle in part 3.
Ooh, another cliffhanger.
Yes.
All right, we'll be back after a short break. We're back for the final part of our deep dive into self-selection.
Okay.
We've explored the process, the benefits,
Uh-huh.
even heard about some pretty remarkable results
Yeah.
from a real-world case study.
It's pretty cool.
But before we wrap up,
Okay.
I want to address kind of the elephant in the room.
Right.
Are there any downsides to this whole self-selection thing?
That's a fair question.
Yeah, it sounds almost too good to be true.
Right. And while the book paints a pretty rosy picture,
Yeah.
it does acknowledge that there are potential risks and challenges to consider.
Okay, so what are some of the potential pitfalls to watch out for?
Well, one potential challenge is that self-selection relies heavily on a culture of trust and transparency.
Okay.
If your organization isn't there yet,
Right?
if there's a lot of fear or micromanagement,
Yeah.
it's unlikely to succeed.
Right. It's like trying to plant a delicate flower in rocky soil. It needs the right environment to thrive.
Absolutely. Another potential challenge is that self-selection can be time-consuming,
Okay.
especially the first time you do it.
Yeah.
You need to plan the event carefully, communicate clearly,
Right.
and allow enough time for people to make thoughtful choices.
So it sounds like it requires a significant investment up front.
It does, and that can be a barrier for some organizations.
Yeah.
Especially those that are under pressure to deliver results quickly.
Makes sense.
There's also the risk that self-selection could exacerbate existing inequalities within an organization.
How so?
If you have a culture where certain groups are already marginalized or excluded,
Right.
self-selection could potentially reinforce those dynamics.
Okay.
For example, if women or people of color are consistently overlooked for leadership roles,
Yeah.
they might end up being left out of the most desirable teams.
So it's important to be mindful of those potential biases and to take steps to mitigate them.
Absolutely, and that might involve having open and honest conversations about diversity and inclusion,
Yeah.
setting clear expectations for equitable team formation,
Okay.
and even providing training on unconscious bias.
So you're saying this has to be approached thoughtfully.
Yes, very thoughtfully.
Okay.
And it's also important to remember that self-selection is not a one-time event.
Right.
It's an ongoing process.
What do you mean by that?
Well, teams change over time.
Right.
People come and go.
Yeah.
Projects evolve. Priorities shift.
It happens all the time.
So it's important to have mechanisms in place for teams to adapt and reconfigure as needed.
So it's not about creating static teams that are set in stone.
Right.
It's about creating a dynamic system
Yes.
that can evolve and respond to change.
Exactly. And that might involve periodic check-ins where teams can reassess their goals, their membership, and their ways of working.
Okay, so even though it's called self-selection,
Uh-huh.
there's still a role for managers and leaders in this process.
Absolutely. Their role shifts from being the decider to being the facilitator.
Okay.
They need to create the conditions for self-selection to succeed, to provide support and guidance, and to ensure that the process is fair and equitable.
So it's less about control and more about empowerment?
Exactly. And the book argues that this shift in leadership style can actually free up managers to focus on more strategic work.
Oh, okay.
Instead of spending their time micromanaging teams,
Yeah.
they can focus on things like setting the overall direction,
Right.
removing roadblocks, and fostering a culture of innovation.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If the teams are self-managing, then the managers can step back
Right.
and focus on the bigger picture.
Exactly.
But what about those of us who aren't in a position to implement self-selection on a company-wide level?
Right.
Are there any takeaways we can apply to our own work,
Yeah,
even if we're just part of a small team?
absolutely. One of the key takeaways from this book is that we all have more agency than we think. Even if you can't choose your entire team, you can still influence the dynamics within your team.
How so?
Well, you can start by having open and honest conversations with your teammates about your strengths, your weaknesses, your working styles, and your aspirations.
Okay.
You can create a team charter that outlines your shared values and goals.
Okay.
You can experiment with different ways of working to find what works best for your team.
Uh-huh.
And you can advocate for more autonomy and ownership within your team,
Okay.
even if it's just in small ways.
So it's about taking ownership of your own team experience,
Yeah,
even if you don't have complete control over the situation.
exactly. And who knows, maybe by demonstrating the benefits of self-selection within your own team,
Yeah,
you can inspire others to embrace this approach on a wider scale.
I like that.
The book even provides a toolkit and some templates to help get the conversation started within your company.
It's like planting a seed.
Yeah.
You might not see the results immediately,
Right.
but with care and attention, it can grow into something amazing.
I love that analogy, and ultimately that's what this whole deep dive has been about.
Yeah.
Exploring new possibilities.
Yeah.
Challenging traditional ways of thinking.
Uh-huh.
And empowering ourselves to create better work experiences.
So we've covered a lot of ground today, from the history of self-selection to the practicalities of implementing it, and even some of the potential challenges and pitfalls to watch out for. But as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. If fear wasn't a factor, what kind of team would you build? Who would be on it? What would you accomplish together? Dream big, folks, because the power to create your ideal team might be closer than you think. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.